Okay, so I just want to go over a couple words of caution with hypothesis testing in general. So the first one is don't base your null hypothesis on what you see in your data. That null hypothesis really should be some sort of word of authority, or is this anticipated value that you should see in the population. Okay, and similarly, you don't want to pick your alternative hypothesis after looking at the data. So maybe you did a good job of it's known that these batteries last 300 hours. And so, you had a good null hypothesis. And so you tested a bunch of batteries, you looked at the data, and you're like, oh, it looks like it's going to be less than that. So that's how you chose your alternative hypothesis. You don't want to choose your alternative hypothesis by looking at your data. You want to have an alternative hypothesis in mind going into the data collection process. Okay, so think of this as being an investigative reporter. You are thinking that there's something wrong with the null hypothesis. And you should have some sense of whether you think it's an overestimate or an underestimate. Or if you're really not sure, that's where the not equal to alternative hypothesis comes into. You're like, I don't know whether it's more or less. I just don't think that the null is the right number. Okay, so you always have that as a backup. But you should go into, before you get into data collection, you should have an idea of, is my alternative less than or greater than? Okay, and with that, you never want to make your alternative hypothesis the thing that you're trying to show true. And the reason for that is the only conclusions that you get out of a hypothesis test are either reject the null or do not reject the null. So we never accept the null hypothesis. It's never a conclusion you're going to get out of a hypothesis test. So if you're trying to show that those batteries don't last 300 hours and the CEO of that company is lying, okay, then that your alternative hypothesis needs to be that the batteries last less than the 300 hours, because that you can show to be true. But you can't show your null hypothesis to be true. Right, which leads into bullet point number 4, which is do not accept the null hypothesis. Never, ever accept the null hypothesis. Your only conclusions are reject the null or do not reject the null. So either we have enough evidence against it or we don't have enough evidence to prove that it's wrong. All right, and then last but not least, don't forget to check your assumptions and conditions. Those are what allow you to use a specific test, so you really do need to check those. As far as your homework goes, you saw this on the last problem, on problem 5 with the wine. If a specific assumption or condition isn't listed, you should put a little star and make a note like, I didn't see this anywhere in the problem, but go ahead and finish the problem. If you were doing this for a research project or you were doing research after college, you either would be checking with your advisor or your primary researcher, or you would have taken enough classes that you know how to address that. There are ways of dealing with some of those issues. Sometimes the only way of dealing with it is to go and get a new sample and start over from scratch. And I've certainly worked with people that I've had to tell them, I'm sorry, there is nothing I can do with this data. The best I could do was use it to kind of refine their process and help them in picking a better hypothesis and getting a better sample, but ultimately they had to go back to the drawing board. So there are some ways of addressing that. As far as the homework goes, just make a note and then continue with the problem. All right, so I hope you're feeling more confident about the one mean Z test and hypothesis tests in general. If you have questions, certainly feel free to visit me for office hours or send me an email.